I want to tell you something before the story begins. I want to tell you that on the morning of the estate reading, I already knew how it was going to end. I had known for 3 months. And I had told no one. Not my brother. Not my daughter. Not the attorney who was about to read a will that described 42 acres of land as if they were his to distribute. I sat in that conference room with 8 members of my extended family, all of them calculating, all of them certain, and I held what I knew the way you hold a match you haven't struck yet. Carefully, quietly waiting for exactly the right moment. The story of how I got to that room is what I'm going to tell you today. But I need to be honest about something first. This is not a simple story about good and evil, where the villain is obvious and the hero is blameless and everything resolves itself neatly at the end. Life, especially at 68 years old, is rarely that cooperative. What this story is about is land. A specific piece of land in eastern Tennessee, 42 acres that my father pulled out of swamp and scrub with his own hands over 30 years and turned into something worth protecting and worth passing down. My name is Harold Dean Marsh. I taught high school agriculture for 31 years. I know what good land is. I know what it costs to build, and I know what it means when someone tries to take what they did not earn. This is what happened. But before I go further, I need to tell you about a number. The number 47. Because 47 is at the center of everything, and you will not fully understand the ending until you understand what 47 means. Hold that. My father's name was Earl Marsh. He was born in 1931, the third of 7 children, and he grew up with nothing in the way that people who grew up with nothing truly understand, not as a story they tell, but as a texture they live inside. A particular kind of cold in the mornings, a particular relationship with objects and tools and soil that people who have always had enough never quite develop. Earl Marsh bought the first 10 acres of what would become the Marsh Farm in 1962. He was 31 years old, and he paid cash, $2,400, money he had saved over 7 years working at a sawmill. I know the exact figure because he kept the receipt in a fireproof box under his bed for the rest of his life, and when he died, that receipt was the first thing I found. The ink had faded to almost nothing, but you could still make out the numbers. $2,400 for 10 acres of bottomland that nobody else had wanted. Over the next 30 years, he turned those 10 acres into 42. He bought parcels as they came available, a corner lot here, a strip of riverfront there. Every purchase documented, every deed filed at the county courthouse in a folder he labeled in his careful, block-letter handwriting, marshland records. He never missed a property tax payment, not one in 40 years. I found those records, too, in the same box. He built everything on that land himself. The farmhouse, the equipment shed, the pond, and the fencing that ran the full perimeter post by post, summer after summer, until you could walk every boundary line of the Marsh Farm and not find a single gap. I am telling you all of this so you understand the specific weight of what my brother Dale was quietly positioning himself to receive. My father had 2 sons, me, Harold, the older by 4 years, and Dale, who had understood himself to be the more important of the 2 of us since approximately the age of 14. I want to be fair about this. Dale was charming in a way I was never charming. He was better at making an impression, better at working a room, better at being remembered. Those are real qualities. I don't dismiss them. But Dale also had a talent, from the time we were teenagers, for being in proximity to something valuable exactly when it was being decided. A gift for positioning himself as the natural next holder of things he hadn't built. Our father saw it. I saw it. But neither of us named it out loud for a long time. When our mother's health began to decline in 2008, Dale moved his family back to the farm. He said it was to help, and in some ways it was. He handled the grocery runs, the doctor's appointments, the insurance calls that left our mother exhausted. I was teaching full-time, 4 hours north, driving down every other weekend, and I will admit that Dale's presence on the ground made the logistics easier. What I didn't see clearly enough, at first, was how Dale's helpfulness was also an occupation. He moved into the farmhouse. Then his wife Brenda moved in. Then their adult son Kyle converted the equipment shed into what could generously be called a studio apartment. Within 18 months, the Marsh family farm had quietly reorganized itself around Dale's presence, with my parents reduced to occupying the main bedroom of a house that no longer felt like theirs. My father noticed. He told me once on a December Saturday when we were walking the fence line together, which was something we had done since I was a boy. He said, "Your brother is making himself comfortable." I said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "Not yet." He looked out across the frozen field for a moment in the way he always did when he was deciding whether to say something further. Then he said, "I've been thinking about some things, Harold, about how to make sure things land right." I said, "Land right?" He said, "When I go." I should have pushed him. I should have asked what he meant by land right, asked what he had been thinking, asked him to say plainly what I suspected we were both circling. But my father was not a man who invited being pushed, and I told myself there would be other walks, other Decembers, other chances to have the conversation we were not quite having. That was the last December we walked the fence line together. I want to give you 3 specific incidents from the years that followed, not vague impressions. Specific things that happened, that I watched happen, and that I did not respond to directly because I kept telling myself a more comfortable story about what was going on. The first. A summer Saturday, 2 years after Dale moved in. I arrived to find Kyle giving a man I didn't know a tour of the equipment shed. Kyle said the man was from the county, someone who was helping him think through some improvements. Improvements to my father's equipment shed. I said politely that I wasn't sure improvements were needed. Kyle said equally politely that it was good to keep up with things. My father was sitting in a lawn chair 20 yards away, watching the whole exchange without expression. Nobody said anything further. The man from the county left. Kyle went inside. My father and I sat in the lawn chairs and looked at the equipment shed for a while, and neither of us put words to what had just happened. The second. A Sunday morning in the kitchen with my mother, alone, when she told me that Dale had mentioned to Gerald, that was Gerald Holt, the family's attorney of 20 years, that the farm might do better as a rental property if things became difficult financially. She said it the way she said things she wasn't sure were safe to say, carefully testing whether the words would hold in the air. I asked if she had agreed to anything. She said no, but that Dale had raised it with Gerald as though it were already under consideration. I drove home that afternoon with my hands too tight on the wheel, and I told myself, this is still manageable. I can still let it resolve on its own. The third. A weekend in the fall, when I arrived and found the fireproof box, the box my father had kept under the bed for 40 years, the one with the land records and the receipts and the Marsh land records folder sitting in the hallway. Not the study, the hallway. As if it had been moved in the process of making room for something else in the study where Kyle had set up his office. That was the moment I stopped telling myself the comfortable story. I didn't say anything to anyone. I carried the box to my car that Sunday evening, and I drove home with it in the passenger seat. Before I left, I stopped at a hardware store and bought a similar-looking box, which I left in the hallway in its place. No one ever mentioned it. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because there is a person I need to tell you about. Someone who enters this story exactly once, says almost nothing, and changes everything. You have not met her yet. Her name was Lucinda Oakes. Lucinda was 61 years old and had been the Blount County Clerk of Courts for 19 years. She and my father had known each other since childhood, gone to the same school in the 40s, stayed in the kind of easy Christmas card contact that people from small towns maintain for a lifetime. She visited my father 3 times in his final year. Once at Christmas, once in summer, and once in October, 6 weeks before he died. I was there for that October visit. My father could sit up in the living room for no more than an hour at a stretch by then. Lucinda arrived with a jar of honey from her daughter's bees and a photograph from a school event in 1951 that she thought he would want to see. They talked for 45 minutes about people they had known, about the way the town had changed, about a teacher they had both apparently been afraid of in the 4th grade. Then Lucinda set down her coffee cup, looked over at me, and said, "Your father has always been a man who does things right." I said, "Yes, ma'am, he has." She said, "I hope you know to look at everything carefully." I said, "I'm sorry?" She looked at my father. My father looked back at her. There was something moving between them that I was only partly inside. She said, "County records are public record. Anyone can look." And then she thanked my mother for the coffee and said she had to be going, and she left. I sat with my father for a long time after that. He said nothing about what Lucinda had said. He talked about the fence on the north boundary needing some attention. He talked about the weather coming in from the west. He talked about a recipe my mother used to make with the black walnuts from the tree by the pond. And then when I hugged him at the door to leave something we had only started doing in the last few years, that particular kind of hello and goodbye, he held on an extra second and said, "You were always the one who paid attention, Harold." 4 hours north, I thought about nothing else. The following Monday morning, I called the Blount County Clerk of Courts. I asked about property records for Earl Marsh. The woman who answered said property records were public and I could search the online database or come in person. I searched the database that night. I want to describe the moment I found it because I have thought about it many times since and I want to be precise. There was no music. There was no dramatic shift in the light. It was 10:30 at night at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee gone cold at my elbow, the county database open on my laptop. And there, filed clearly, indexed plainly, sitting in the public record the way it had been sitting there for decades without anyone thinking to look, deed of transfer. Earl Marsh, grantor. Harold Dean Marsh, grantee, full parcel, 42 acres, with a retained life estate reserved for Earl Marsh and his wife Martha for the duration of their natural lives. Signed, witnessed, notarized, recorded with the county. The date of filing was in 1978. 47 years. The deed had been in the public record for 47 years. I sat there for a very long time without moving. I thought about 1978. I had been 21 years old. My father had been 47, the same number, I realized. He had transferred the farm to me at the age of 47, the year his oldest son turned 21. He had retained the right to live on it, and work it, and call it home, for as long as he and my mother were alive. But the land, the 42 acres, the farmhouse, the equipment shed, the pond, the fence posts running straight around the full perimeter had been in my name for almost 50 years. Dale didn't know. Brenda didn't know. Kyle, who had worked for a title company and was comfortable with documents, had apparently never thought to search the county records for the property he was quietly helping his father position himself to inherit. And Gerald, the attorney who had been drafting my father's will for 20 years, had apparently never verified whether the land his client was preparing to distribute was actually his to distribute. I went to my closet and opened the fireproof box. Inside it, exactly as I had remembered, was my father's copy of the deed of transfer from 1978, his copy, with both our signatures and a county stamp and the notary seal. Matching, document for document, what I had just found in the online database. I held that piece of paper for a long time. I thought about what my father had said on the fence line that December, about how to make sure things land right. I thought about Lucinda Oakes and her jar of honey and her 3 deliberate words, county records are public. I thought about what it meant that a man had filed a deed in 1978, kept his copy in a box under his bed for 47 years, and then arranged for the county clerk he had known since childhood to walk into his living room 6 weeks before he died and aim 3 words at his eldest son like a compass pointing north. He hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't forgotten the deed. He had been waiting for circumstances that would make the deed necessary. And then, when those circumstances arrived, he had made sure I knew where to look. I did not call anyone that night. I opened a second browser tab and I searched for property law attorneys in my area, and I found the name of a woman named Frances Webb who had 30 years of experience in estate and property law and whose firm bio described her as methodical. I wrote her name on a notepad and I went to bed. In the morning, I called her office. Frances Webb reviewed my deed, the county records, and a copy of my father's existing will in a single meeting. She looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Mr. Marsh, your father's will cannot transfer what he no longer owned at the time of his death. A deed transfer with a retained life estate conveys the property to the grantee at the time of filing. Your father remained the life tenant, meaning he held the right to live there and use the land during his lifetime. But legal title to the property transferred to you in 1978. The will has no authority over it." She said it simply, as a fact. I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want to act on this now, or do you want to wait for the estate reading?" I thought about my mother, who was still on the farm, who was 80 years old and in fragile health, and who I did not want frightened or confused or placed in the middle of a confrontation she had not chosen. I thought about what my father would have done. My father had waited 47 years. I said, "I want to wait for the estate reading. I want everyone in the room when it happens." Frances said, "That is your right." I said, "I know. My mother passed in February, 8 weeks after my father. She had outlived him by exactly that long, and I believe now that she had been waiting for permission to go, the way some people do. The farm passed fully to me the day she died, under the terms of the retained life estate my father had arranged in 1978. I told no one. The estate reading was scheduled for a Thursday in March. I want to describe the conference room for you, because rooms have character, and this one had a particular kind of character that morning. Long table, 9 chairs, the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look a little more tired than they are. A window that looked out onto a parking lot where the trees hadn't decided yet whether to bud. Dale and Brenda sat directly across from me. Kyle sat beside his father. Dale's daughter, Andrea, sat beside Kyle. 2 spouses, a neighbor who had witnessed my father's will, and Gerald Holt, who had the look of a man entirely confident about what the next 30 minutes contained. I sat at the end of the table. Frances sat beside me. Between us, on the empty chair, I had placed a manila folder. Gerald thanked everyone, expressed his condolences, and began. He described the estate, the property, at the family address, comprising 42 acres and all improvements, along with personal property and a savings account. He explained that per the terms of the will, the property and savings were to be divided equally between the 2 sons, Harold and Dale. Personal items were listed and distributed in a schedule attached. Dale was nodding before Gerald finished the sentence. The nod of a man confirming what he had known for years was coming. Gerald asked if there were any questions before he continued. I said, "Before we continue, I'd like to offer a correction." Nobody moved. I opened the folder. I took out the stack of document copies Frances had prepared, the deed, the county filing, the chain of title certification, and I slid them down the table. I said, "My father transferred this property to me 47 years ago. The deed is filed with Blount County and has been continuously in the public record since 1978. He retained a life estate for himself and my mother, which is why he was able to live on the land until his death. But legal title to the property has been in my name since I was 21 years old. The farm is not part of the estate. It was not my father's to leave. It has been mine for almost 5 decades. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to count the seconds. Kyle was the first to pick up the deed copy. He had worked for a title company. He knew what he was looking at. I watched his face move through, understanding the way weather moves across a field. You can see exactly where it is and exactly where it's going. He set the paper down without saying anything. He did not look at his father. Dale said, "That's not possible." Gerald, to his considerable credit, did not say that sounds right. He said, carefully, that he would need to review the document. I said he was welcome to take all the time he needed. The meeting went on for 2 more hours. Gerald made calls to other attorneys and to the county records office, which confirmed what the document stated. Francis answered questions with the patient precision of someone who had prepared for every question that was asked. Dale moved through stages disbelief, then a sustained effort to find an error, then a long, careful silence that was harder to watch than the disbelief had been. At one point, Brenda said that my father would have wanted things to be fair. I said, I believe he did. Kyle had stopped consulting his phone. He sat with the deed copy in front of him and looked at the window that faced the parking lot. Andrea, Dale's daughter, said nothing at all. She looked at her father once and then looked down at the table and did not look up again. There was no legal challenge with any ground to stand on. The deed was unambiguous. The filing was 50-year-old public record. The chain of title certification was clean. Frances had done her work carefully, the way you do when the work matters. Gerald closed his folder at the end of the meeting and said he would be in touch with both parties to settle the remaining estate items, the personal property, the savings account according to the will's terms as they applied to assets that were actually part of the estate. I thanked him and stood up. In the parking lot, everyone else was gone before Dale and I reached our vehicles. It was a cold March afternoon, the kind where the sky can't commit to a color, and Dale was standing beside his truck looking like a man who had just arrived at a number he didn't know how to carry. He said, "You knew." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" I said, 3 months. Since the Monday after Lucinda Oakes visited Dad in October. He was quiet. Then he said, "He always liked you better." I thought about that for a moment. The thing about that sentence is that it's not entirely false and not what anyone thinks it means. I said, "I don't think it was about liking Dale. I think it was about who was going to take care of it right." He didn't answer. I said, "You can keep using the equipment shed while you find another place. I'll give you 6 months. I'd like the house back by June." He said, "That's fair." I said, "He built that shed himself. Poured the foundation, framed the walls, put up the roof in a week one August. I know what it would mean to him to see it treated like an afterthought." Dale got in his truck. He sat for a moment without starting it. Then he said, through the open window, "Fence on the north boundary needs work." I said, "I know. I'm going to fix it." He started the truck and drove away. I stood in the parking lot until I couldn't see his taillights anymore. When I got back to the farm, my daughter Karen was sitting on the front steps with a thermos of coffee. She had driven up that morning without telling me she was coming, which is exactly what Karen does when she's been watching something from a distance and can't wait any longer. Karen is 38 years old. She is an accountant. She has her grandfather's quality of looking at a problem long enough to see it clearly before she says anything about it. She stood up when she saw my face and said, "Tell me all of it." So I sat down on the steps of my father's farmhouse with the afternoon light going flat and the coffee still warm, and I told her everything. The county database, Lucinda Oakes and her jar of honey, the fireproof box in my closet, Francis Webb and the document copies, the meeting, Kyle's face when he read the deed, Dale in the parking lot. Karen listened to all of it without once interrupting, which is a rarer skill than people acknowledge. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Grandpa did that on purpose. All of it." I said, "I think so." She said, "He could have told you." When he filed the deed, or any time after? I said yes, he could have. She said, "Why didn't he?" I had been thinking about this for 3 months. I thought about it on the drive home from the attorney's office in the fall and on the Sunday evenings driving north after visits, and in the particular silence of the kitchen at 10:30 at night with a cold cup of coffee and a laptop screen. I said, I think he needed me to find it. Not because he was testing me. Because he understood that there's a difference between knowing something and understanding it. If he had told me in 1978, it would have been information. Because I found it myself, in the context of needing it, it was something I could actually hold. I think he knew, that the people who were going to come for that land would come after he was gone. And he needed me to arrive at the knowledge on my own terms, in my own time, because that's the only version of the knowledge that doesn't leave when things get hard. Karen thought about that for a while. The light was going now, the sky that particular gray-blue it gets in early spring before the dark settles in. Then she said, "Was it enough?" I said yes. The finding was the earning. She poured me a cup of coffee from the thermos, and we sat on the porch steps until it was fully dark and the stars came out over the field. Dale and Brenda left in the 4th month of the 6 I had given them, which I think was its own kind of dignity. Kyle went back to the city. I have not heard from him since, and I do not expect to. I moved into the farmhouse in April. I spent the spring repairing the places where deferred maintenance had gotten ahead of the structure new gutters on the east side. The kitchen window that had never sealed properly, 3 boards on the back porch that gave under your weight in a way my father would not have tolerated. In the summer, I fixed the fence on the north boundary. I did it the way my father did post, by hand, measuring each run of wire carefully before I stapled it. It took 6 weeks. Some things are worth doing slowly, and that is one of them. Near the end of it, in the last section of the north fence, I pulled a corner post that was set deeper than the others. It had been replaced sometime in the 70s. The wood was older, the concrete footing poured differently from the ones around it. I pulled it to reset it, and when I turned it over I found, carved into the underside, the part that sits in the earth, the part no one would ever see unless they pulled the post, 2 letters. E. M. Earl Marsh. My father had signed his work underground, in the place where no one would find it unless they were taking care of the fence. I stood there in the north field for a long time holding that post. I thought about a man who saved for 7 years and paid cash for 10 acres of swampy bottomland. A man who filed a deed in 1978 and kept his copy in a box under his bed for the rest of his life. A man who arranged for an old friend to walk into his living room 6 weeks before he died and say 3 words to his oldest son. A man who signed his name underground because he understood that the work, and not the credit, was the thing that mattered. I set the post back the way I found it, EM, facing down into the earth. I packed the concrete in tighter than before, and I set it a few inches deeper, and I moved on to the next post. The fence is done now. It runs true around the full perimeter of the Marsh farm. There is something I want to say to you, something I have been turning over for 2 years and have finally found the right words for. My father was not a man who said, "I love you" easily. We were not that kind of family in that particular way. But he transferred 42 acres to my name in 1978, and he kept the deed in a fireproof box for 47 years. And he arranged things with the care and patience of a man who understood that protection is a form of love, that preparation is a form of love, that signing your name in the place only the right person will think to look is a form of love. He trusted me to pay attention. He trusted me to still be standing when the moment came. He trusted me to find it myself and to understand what it meant when I did. I know what that means. The fireproof box is on my desk now. Inside it, the land records, the deed of transfer, and the original receipt, $2,400, 1962, the ink faded to nothing but the numbers still there if you hold it to the right light. I look at it sometimes in the morning when the coffee is brewing and the light comes in through the kitchen window, and I think about a 31-year-old man who saw something in 10 acres of bottomland that nobody else could see, who saw not what it was, but what it could become. That is the gift. Not the land, though I am grateful for the land. The gift is understanding what kind of people build things that last. They are not the ones who talk loudest about building. They are the ones who show up with tools. They are the ones who sign their work in the place only the right person will look. They are the ones who make provisions, quietly and without announcement, that hold long after they are gone. I am 68 years old. I have 31 years of teaching behind me and 42 acres in front of me, and a daughter who drives 4 hours unannounced when she can't wait any longer. I have a fence that runs true, and a box on my desk, and the weight of the right kind of inheritance. I think my father would say I'm doing all right. I think he'd be right. Now, as I always do, what would you have done if you had found that deed at 10:30 on a Monday night, with everything still ahead of you? Would you have called Dale right then? Would you have confronted it differently? Or would you have waited, the way I waited, the way my father waited, for the moment when all the right people were in the room? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and your answers often show me things I hadn't seen from where I was standing. Before you go, there is one more story I have been thinking about. It's about a woman who spent 40 years building a small business from nothing, a catering business. Started in her kitchen, grown into something real. And a son-in-law who, while she was in the hospital recovering from a hip replacement, had certain documents quietly revised. He thought he had been thorough. He had not accounted for the fact that her accountant of 30 years had kept one copy of one original document in a locked drawer, because, she said later, she always had a feeling about that man. That story is the one I think about when someone asks me whether people always get away with it. They don't. I'll see you there. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, events, and situations are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment purposes only.